The rain lashed against the tall glass windows of Alexander Grayson's penthouse office, blurring the vibrant cityscape below. At 42, Alexander was one of the most influential businessmen in the country, commanding an empire worth billions. Yet, behind his polished exterior and impeccable three-piece suit, there was a certain hollowness that not even his immense wealth could fill. Samantha Carter, his secretary, was the kind of woman who moved through life unnoticed by most. A quiet, hard-working individual in her early 30s, she spent her days navigating Alexander's tightly wound schedule. She had a knack for solving problems, predicting needs before they were voiced, and maintaining a calm demeanor, even when Alexander's temper flared. On this particular evening, Samantha lingered at her desk long after most of the office had emptied. She was poring over contracts that needed review before an early meeting the next morning when Alexander appeared in the doorway of his office. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his tone sharp but laced with curiosity. "I wanted to make sure the agreements for tomorrow are in order," she replied, not looking up. "You're not paid to work yourself into the ground," he said, stepping into the room. She smiled faintly. "Neither are you, but you're still here too." He chuckled, an unusual sound from the usually stoic man. For a moment, the tension between boss and employee dissolved into something lighter, more human. As the night deepened, Alexander offered to drive Samantha home, citing the storm as a concern. She hesitated but eventually agreed. The rain had only grown heavier, and the streets were flooded with water and chaos. It was on the darkened highway that their lives changed forever. Alexander was driving carefully, the windshield wipers battling the relentless rain. Samantha sat quietly beside him, her thoughts drifting to the comforts of her small apartment. Suddenly, headlights appeared out of nowhere, veering dangerously into their lane. Alexander reacted instantly, swerving to avoid a collision. The car spun violently, skidding across the slick road before crashing into a guardrail. When Alexander regained consciousness, the world was a blur of flashing lights and muffled voices. Pain shot through his chest, but his first thought was Samantha. Turning his head, he saw her slumped against the passenger seat, unconscious. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead. Panic gripped him as he shouted for help, his usual composure shattered. Emergency responders arrived swiftly, pulling them from the wreckage. At the hospital, Alexander's injuries were deemed minor, but Samantha's condition was critical. She required emergency surgery, and the doctors were candid about her chances. They were slim without immediate intervention. "Do whatever it takes," Alexander ordered, his voice trembling. "I'll cover every expense. Just save her." Over the next few days, Alexander remained at the hospital, refusing to leave Samantha's side. The image of her lifeless body in the car haunted him, igniting a guilt he couldn't shake. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, not because of a failing deal or a declining market, but because the life of someone he cared about hung in the balance. When Samantha finally opened her eyes, weak and disoriented, Alexander was there, his usually stern expression softened with relief. "You're awake," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Her gaze flickered to him, confusion evident. "What happened?" "You were in an accident," he explained gently. "But you're safe now. The doctors, they said you're going to be okay." Tears welled in her eyes, both from the pain and the overwhelming realization that she was alive. "You saved me," she whispered. "It was the least I could do," he replied, his throat tight. As Samantha recovered, Alexander visited her daily. The boundaries of their professional relationship blurred as they shared stories, laughter, and moments of vulnerability. He learned about her struggles growing up, her dreams of becoming a writer, and the sacrifices she made to support her younger brother. She, in turn, discovered the man behind the empire, a boy who had grown up lonely and burdened by expectations, who had built walls so high that even he struggled to see over them. Samantha couldn't deny the growing warmth she felt for him, but it was complicated. He was her boss, a man so far removed from her world that it seemed impossible for them to coexist beyond the confines of the office. Alexander, too, wrestled with feelings he hadn't anticipated. Samantha's resilience and kindness had touched something deep within him, stirring emotions he had long buried. But their budding connection was tested when whispers of their closeness reached the corporate world. Rumors spread like wildfire, threatening both their reputations. Alexander's board of directors raised concerns, and Samantha faced judgment from colleagues who saw her as nothing more than a social climber. Even as the world conspired to keep them apart, they found solace in one another, their bond growing stronger with each challenge. As the days turned into weeks, Samantha slowly regained her strength, though the weight of the accident lingered. The scars on her body were a reminder of how fragile life could be, but they were nothing compared to the gratitude she felt toward Alexander. However, their world outside the hospital walls had not paused. Alexander's business empire demanded his attention, and the rumors swirling about his relationship with Samantha reached a boiling point. Alex, his most trusted advisor, Richard, began during an early morning meeting. "We need to talk about the situation with your secretary." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What situation?" Richard exchanged glances with the other board members, who had gathered around the long mahogany table. "There's talk, speculation about your relationship with Miss Carter. It's beginning to reflect poorly on the company." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And what, exactly, are people saying?" "That you've shown favoritism. That you've been involved," Richard said carefully. "It's becoming a distraction. Investors are asking questions." Alexander's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "Miss Carter was in a life-threatening accident. I offered her the same compassion I'd extend to any valued employee. If that's unacceptable, then perhaps we need to reevaluate what this company stands for." The room fell silent, the weight of his words suffocating any further objections. Samantha, meanwhile, was facing her own battles. Though her physical recovery was progressing, returning to the office felt daunting. She had overheard the whispers and seen the judgmental looks from her coworkers. "Do you think it's true?" one of the junior assistants whispered as Samantha walked past the break room. "I mean, why else would he visit her every day?" another replied, barely lowering her voice. Samantha pretended not to hear, though her heart ached. She had worked tirelessly for years to build her career, yet now it seemed all anyone could see was a scandal. She retreated to her desk, her hands trembling as she opened her laptop. Moments later, Alexander appeared, his presence commanding as always. "Walk with me," he said softly. They stepped into the quiet corridor, away from prying eyes. "I heard what's been happening," Alexander said, his gaze piercing but kind. "I'm sorry you've been put through this." "It's not your fault," she replied, though the strain in her voice betrayed her. "People will think what they want." His brow furrowed. "They don't know you like I do. They don't know your strength, your integrity." Her breath hitched. "And they don't know you like I do," she whispered. "You're not the man they make you out to be. You're so much more." For a moment, the space between them felt electric, charged with unspoken emotions. But before either could speak, the elevator dinged, and they were forced to part. Despite the growing tension, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about Samantha. She had become a part of his life in a way no one else had, a confidant, a mirror reflecting his better self. One evening, he found himself standing outside her modest apartment, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. It was uncharacteristic for him, the billionaire accustomed to grand gestures and extravagant displays. But with Samantha, simplicity felt right. When she opened the door, her surprise quickly turned into a warm smile. "Mr. Grayson?" "Alexander," he corrected gently. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd check on you." She laughed softly, stepping aside to let him in. Her apartment was cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and shelves of well-worn books. It was a stark contrast to his sleek, minimalist penthouse, yet it felt infinitely more welcoming. Over tea, they talked about everything and nothing. He shared stories of his childhood, of a father who had been more businessman than parent, and a mother whose love had been buried under layers of societal expectations. Samantha listened intently, her heart breaking for the lonely boy he had once been. As the evening stretched on, their connection deepened. But just as the air seemed thick with the possibility of something more, Samantha hesitated. "Alexander," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to ask you something." "Anything," he replied, leaning closer. "Why me?" The question hung in the air. She wasn't just asking why he had saved her life or visited her in the hospital. She was asking why he had opened his guarded heart to her. His gaze softened. Because you see me, he said simply. The real me. And that's something I've spent my entire life searching for. But love, no matter how genuine, is rarely straightforward. Alexander's world was filled with challenges Samantha couldn't have anticipated. One day, a powerful competitor threatened to dismantle a crucial part of his business. At the same time, Samantha's estranged brother resurfaced, desperate for help and dragging her into his chaotic world. As these external pressures mounted, their relationship was tested in ways neither had imagined. Would their love be enough to bridge the gap between their vastly different lives? Alexander paced his office, the weight of the latest crisis pressing down on him. The rival company, Helios Ventures, had launched a hostile campaign, undermining Grayson Corporation's core operations. Reports of leaks, undercut deals, and aggressive acquisitions filled his inbox. Richard, his advisor, stood nearby, looking grim. They're relentless, Alex. They've secured 3 of our smaller suppliers in the last week. If they keep going, they'll force us to outsource at double the cost. Alexander's mind raced, but amidst the chaos, one thought lingered. How could he protect the people who mattered most, especially Samantha? Samantha, meanwhile, was grappling with a storm of her own. Her younger brother, David, had shown up unannounced at her apartment 2 nights ago. Once a promising college student, David had fallen into a cycle of bad decisions, gambling debts, and trouble with dangerous people. "Sis, I didn't know where else to go," he'd said, his voice trembling as he stood on her doorstep. Samantha couldn't bring herself to turn him away, but his presence complicated everything. Alexander had already saved her life. She couldn't bear to drag him into her family's mess. "David," she said, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table. "You can't stay here forever. What's your plan?" His head hung low, shame etched across his face. I just need time. I owe some people money. A lot of money." "How much?" When he told her the amount, Samantha's heart sank. It was more than she made in a year. "I can't pay that," she said softly. "I know," David whispered. "But maybe your boss." "No," she interrupted sharply, standing up. "I won't involve Alexander in this." David looked at her with pleading eyes. "He's rich, isn't he? He could make this go away." "It's not his responsibility," she said firmly. But the truth was, she wasn't sure how to fix the situation. That evening, as Samantha sat alone, her thoughts a tangled web of fear and uncertainty, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Alexander. "Dinner tonight? My treat. I have something to discuss with you." She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. The last thing she wanted was to burden him with her problems, but the thought of seeing him brought a flicker of comfort. "Okay. Where?" Alexander had reserved a private room at a quiet, upscale restaurant. When Samantha arrived, he stood to greet her, his usual commanding presence softened by the warmth in his smile. "You look beautiful," he said, pulling out her chair. Samantha blushed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thanks. You look stressed." He chuckled lightly. "Accurate." As they ate, Alexander confided in her about the challenges with Helios Ventures. Samantha listened intently, her admiration for his resilience growing. "You'll figure it out," she said with quiet certainty. "You always do." Her faith in him was a balm he hadn't realized he needed. When the conversation turned to her, Samantha hesitated. She wanted to tell him about David, about the mounting pressure she felt, but the words caught in her throat. "Is something wrong?" Alexander asked, his perceptive gaze studying her. Samantha opened her mouth, then closed it again, debating whether to burden him. Finally, she sighed. "It's my brother. He's in trouble. Financial trouble." Alexander leaned forward, concern etched on his face. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that he's scared for his life," she admitted, her voice trembling. For a moment, Alexander said nothing. Then, he reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "Let me help." Samantha shook her head. "I can't let you do that. You've already done so much for me." "This isn't about what I've done," he said gently. "It's about what's right. You don't have to face this alone." Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. You don't understand. People will think I'm taking advantage of you. Let them think what they want, he said firmly. What matters is what we know to be true. True to his word, Alexander took action. Within days, he had discreetly paid off David's debts and arranged for him to enter a rehabilitation program. Samantha was overwhelmed with gratitude, but she also felt a gnawing guilt. You didn't have to do this, she said one evening as they stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights twinkling below. I wanted to, he replied. But why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his expression earnest. Because I care about you, Samantha. And because I know what it's like to feel like the world is closing in. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the world around them faded. Without thinking, she stepped closer, their faces inches apart. I don't know what I did to deserve you, she said softly. He smiled. You just had to be yourself. As their relationship deepened, they faced more challenges. Alexander's business rivals grew more ruthless, and Samantha continued to grapple with her place in his world. But through it all, they found strength in each other. Yet, both knew there was still a long road ahead. Would their love withstand the relentless pressures of Alexander's empire and the whispers of a world quick to judge?